Hey Squishies! For those of you not familiar with me, I'm Jennifer Blue. I used to blog about animation, and the last year or so I've mostly been streaming video games that I don't play very well. But I am also a graduate student in the social work program at the University of Maryland, Baltimore. And this is a slightly expanded version of a presentation I gave for my psychopathology class this week. I was talking about it with friends, and several people expressed an interest in seeing it, so I figured I'd just throw it up on YouTube. I'm going to be splitting this into two parts because it runs a little long. I'm going to try to keep each part to under 40 minutes. The first part will cover the DSM diagnosis for gender dysphoria, what the experience of gender dysphoria is like in the words of people who have it, and the history of the diagnosis. The second part will then get into treatment, some recent interesting developments in neuropsych that could give insight into the causes of gender dysphoria and, in fact, how gender itself forms, and conclude with a discussion of kind of the core topic of the presentation, the issues with the gender dysphoria diagnosis as written, and the controversy over whether it belongs in the DSM. I'm going to be referencing the DSM a lot. If you're not familiar, it is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. It is kind of the official compendium made by the American Psychiatric Association that lists psychiatric disorders, how to diagnose them, and how to differentiate them from other disorders that might be mistaken for, among some other information about each disorder. It is a useful book, but it is always a work in progress, which is why it's been revised many times over the years. It is currently on the 5th edition, published in 2013, and that edition is already showing some signs of needing revision. And that's part of what we'll be talking about. Before that, though, some terminology. So we'll start with something very basic. What is gender? There's quite a lot of different definitions of it floating around, but the one I usually go with is that gender is a biopsychosocial phenomenon and a culturally constructed system of classifying people. Biopsychosocial is a sort of portmanteau word we use a lot in social work, because a lot of the phenomena we deal with are a mixture of biological, psychological, and sociological factors, all kind of engaging in an interplay, and that is definitely the case with gender. Your gender is at the same time a physical fact about you, a cognitive processing set of learned behaviors and emotional registers, and a culturally constructed classification system. Now, the most common term for someone's kind of true gender, for lack of a better way to phrase it, is gender identity. The problem is that this is also used in legal contexts to mean whether or not someone is trans, essentially. For example, in anti-discrimination laws. And so that's a little confusing. Also, in my view, and in the view of some researchers who have therefore used different terms, it kind of conflates two subtly separate things. So I prefer the term core gender, which is roughly equivalent to Julia Serrano's subconscious gender, which is a person's internalized sense of their own gender. You'll note from Serrano's name for it, this is not a conscious thing. This is the underlying subconscious notion of gender that drives emotion and behavior, but doesn't necessarily always rise into conscious awareness as it's doing so. For that, we have to turn to conscious gender, which is also subsumed into the term gender identity. That's the gender a person consciously identifies themselves as being. It's what they think of themselves as when they are consciously thinking about themselves. These are not necessarily the same thing. Within the trans community, we refer to someone whose core gender and conscious gender are different as an egg, because typically what is happening in that scenario is that they are trans but have not yet realized they're trans due to cultural pressure to not be trans. Gender expression is a third distinct aspect of gender. Gender expression are the signals a person sends that communicate their gender. These signals are the most significant culturally constructed element of gender. Every culture has a defined set of gender categories for which it defines more loosely or rigidly, depending on the culture, specific roles and specific ways of signaling that you are part of that gender. Some of the common ones are the display of secondary sexual characteristics, such as having a beard, clothing in different cultures, different cuts of clothing, styles, materials, colors can all be used to indicate gender. Speech can be used to indicate gender, not just in the sense of you can tell people what your gender is, what your pronouns are, give them a name that has gender associations to it, but also how you speak can signal your gender. For example, in some languages, in many languages, the third person pronouns are gendered, as in English, for example, he and she, but in some languages, first person pronouns are also gendered. You will use a different word for I, depending on your gender. Also, other elements of speech. What vocabulary you select may vary by gender between cultures in ways that aren't necessarily conscious, but are consistent across the culture. Sometimes it's to do with tone. For example, in English, typically, again, this is like an average typical thing. There are always going to be exceptions in a population as large as English-speaking people. But typically speaking, in English and a number of other languages, men speak in a monotone that resonates in their chest, while women resonate their voices in their heads and have more variance in pitch as they speak. Body language can also indicate gender. Different kinds of gestures can be expected by a society of different genders. People of different genders may take up different amounts of space with their gestures and with just how they sit and so forth. How people sit may vary. How people walk may vary. In fact, any behavior can be a signal of gender if the culture has coded it as such. The signals are, in fact, fundamentally arbitrary. The culture assigns them based on a mix of traditions, fashions, and individual creativity. Assigned gender is not an aspect of a person's gender, but it is an aspect of how their gender manifests in the world, so to speak. Assigned gender is how other people interpret a person's gender expression. When they look at that person, what gender do they think that they see? It is not uncommon, even among cis people, which is a term we'll define in a moment, but it means people who aren't trans. Even among cis people, it is not uncommon to mistake someone's gender and need to be corrected because you misinterpreted their gendered signals. For example, if you're walking behind a man with long hair, you may mistakenly think that he's a woman until he turns around and you see signals that indicate he's not, because long hair, less so, more in some time periods than others, but in Western culture, long hair has often been a signal of femininity. It's not inevitably one, that can be changed, and it's not always one at any point in history, but that is commonly, frequently, a way in which it's interpreted. Assigned gender at birth is a very important form of assigned gender for what we're going to be talking about. Assigned gender at birth is the gender assigned to a person at, or increasingly in industrialized societies before birth, by a doctor, nurse, or midwife. and the incredibly rigorous, scientifically heavily determined process by which they decide what gender to assign to the person consists of checking if there's a penis. If there is, they say it's a boy. If there isn't, they say it's a girl. I, as you may have guessed, was being sarcastic about the rigor of this process. It, in fact, has no scientific basis whatsoever and is just tradition, which, as with everything else around gender, is ultimately arbitrary. Somebody who is cisgender describes someone whose assigned gender at birth was correct. Now, as it turns out, using the penis or absence thereof to guess is not a bad approximation. Most of the time, the doctor is right. There are more cis people than trans people. So whatever the doctor declares upon seeing the penis or not seeing the penis turns out to actually be the person's core gender when they're old enough to express it themselves. Somebody who's transgender describes those cases where the doctor was wrong. The doctor made a guess based on presence or absence of penis, and as the person got old enough to express their gender, possibly taking a longer time to do so because of social pressure to be cis, they turn out to not have the core gender that the doctor guessed they would. Now, somebody who's non-binary, we've been talking about, when we talk about gender in English, we usually talk about boys and girls, but those are not the only options. In many cultures throughout the world, other genders are recognized, and increasingly, in English-speaking cultures and in Western cultures generally, other genders are coming to be recognized. They've always been here, now we're starting to acknowledge it as a culture. And we refer to these genders as non-binary. Men and women, or boys and girls, are the binary genders. All other genders are the non-binary genders. Of which there may well be as many as there are non-binary people. It doesn't really matter. There's nothing gained by limiting the numbers of genders. Gender fluidity, a gender fluid person, is a non-binary person whose core gender changes over time. Some days or weeks or months, depends on the person, they may be a particular gender, and then other days, weeks, months, they're another gender, and they move around between genders. Those might be the two binary genders. It might be one binary gender and one or more other genders. It might be any number of other genders and never one of the binary genders. It could be any combination. These are all observed phenomena that exist, which is an important thing to keep in mind. Trans people, non-binary people, gender fluid people, they exist. If you make the effort, you can go out and meet them. If they don't fit into your theories of how gender works, then your theories are wrong. That's how science works. So how is gender dysphoria covered in the DSM? Spoilers, not well. So there's two sets of criteria for identifying gender dysphoria in the DSM. The first is for children, which means typically prepubescent children. And it requires an incongruity of experienced gender, that is the gender that the child expresses or feels that they are, that accords with their own experience, and assigned gender, including at least 6 of a list of symptoms that have persisted for at least 6 months. One of those symptoms is required, and this is important because transphobes, I'm not going to split hairs on this, transphobes will sometimes say that the criteria for children talk about things like preferring toys and games stereotypical of a gender other than the one they were assigned at birth, and say, see, if a boy plays with dolls, they just label them trans. That is false. Because the required criterion is a strong desire to be or insistent that one is a gender other than the gender assigned at birth. That's important because that means that a boy who plays with dolls is a boy who plays with dolls, which is, you know, it's a tautology. It's just true. A boy who plays with dolls is a boy who plays with dolls. They're not a trans girl. However, children are often not good at expressing in words how they feel and what their identity is, because that they haven't yet learned how to do so. That takes a long time to do. So they will express things through play and make-believe and so forth, that an adolescent or an adult would use language for. That's why play therapy is so common when doing therapy with young children, because that is how children communicate. So that's where you gather the evidence, the symptoms that's how they're going to be expressed in a child. But you still have as the core requirement that the child states they are or want to be a gender other than the one they were assigned at birth. A boy who plays with dolls is not a trans girl. Someone who was assigned male at birth says that they're a girl and plays with dolls. Might be, if they also have multiple other indicators. Again, children can't really say whether or not they're trans very well, so we have a stronger requirement of evidence from things other than speech. With adolescents and adults, we only need 2 symptoms because adolescents and adults can more clearly express themselves. It also needs to be of 6 months duration. It needs to be the same incongruity, but the ways in which the incongruity can be expressed are a little more grown up. Expressing desires, expressing convictions, these are things that adolescents and adults can do, so we can use them as criteria. Now, I want you to notice something about this. There's a lot about gender in here. There's nothing about dysphoria. That is kind of the core problem with the DSM's entry on gender dysphoria. Dysphoria literally means feeling bad. There is no bad feeling. Actually, it literally means feeling off balance, but it's used as an antonym for euphoria. It's the opposite. It is an intense negative feeling, and that's not on here. There's mention of strong dislike of one's sexual anatomy for children, and there's mention of desire to be rid of your primary or secondary sex characteristics for adults, but there's not really something here that captures what the word dysphoria expresses. More importantly, these aren't a disorder that's being described here. This is just being trans. Now, there's an additional criterion that is very common in the DSM, which is kind of the fundamental criteria for something to be considered a disorder, which is that it causes clinically significant distress or impairment to function. So the gender dysphoria diagnosis still isn't gender dysphoria, it's you're trans and it hurts, which kind of is what gender dysphoria is, but it doesn't get at what the actual symptoms of it are. And that's a serious problem because it's still fundamentally treating being trans as a disorder. Especially because it then goes on to contradict itself and say that you don't need distress to be diagnosed with gender dysphoria, which is very odd, and we'll get into why that's there in part 2. So what actually are the symptoms of gender dysphoria? The DSM isn't doing a good job of telling us that. So we need to go to, ultimately, the source of what the symptoms are for any disorder, which is asking the people who have it how they feel. Ultimately, that is how we learn what all symptoms are. We know that people with colds cough and sneeze and feel lousy and feverish because people with colds tell us that that's how they feel and show us that that's how they feel. We know that people with depression feel worthless because they say, I feel worthless. So what do people with gender dysphoria say about how they feel? So I took some quotes from the website of a doctor who specializes in treating, or rather a psychologist, PsyD, who specializes in treating people with gender dysphoria and issues around gender, and has quotes of how gender dysphoria feels on their website. I selected some of those. You can also find similar things in YouTube videos or asking trans people anywhere that trans people congregate. I also inserted 2 quotes from myself because I also have gender dysphoria. I'm trans, I have gender dysphoria. I can tell you what it feels like to me. That would not be sufficient to be the basis for a diagnosis, but it certainly could be data points for getting a sense of how it feels for lots of people. Hating parts of you that are beautiful because they don't feel like they're yours. Like you're just a pile of masks. You could put one on and wear it and pretend to be a person, but there's no one underneath. When you look in the mirror and can't recognize your own body as human, let alone yours. A deep and abiding wrongness, a dread at the notion of continued existence. Like there's a sheet of dirty glass between you and the world. Colors are dulled, feelings are muted, everything is just a little off. And because it's always been that way, you have no idea what's wrong or how to fix it. It's crushing and just makes me want to hide in my house or cry. The worst part of it for me is the feeling of betrayal. Like my body has betrayed me, is betraying me, will betray me again. It feels like I'm wrong, like the fault light is on for my body and I can't fix it. There's no way to accept or love yourself, but if you try hard enough, you can be numb. I can't look at my body without crying and wanting to manually cut bits off my body to make me feel like me. It makes me feel physically ill. A silent killer. It killed my hopes and dreams without knowing why. It kept me isolated and full of shameful secrets and suppressed my ability to socialize. It left me riddled with anxiety and cut off from family and friends. Missing a stare. Forever. Going back to the DSM and some of the other information it provides, again, of mixed quality, but it's the manual. The DSM includes what are called specifiers, which are optional things you can put in a diagnosis to give additional information specific to the disorder in question. For gender dysphoria, there are 2 available specifiers. With a disorder of sex development, which is referring to what are also known as intersex people. People whose physical features are not the kind of standard set you learned in 8th grade biology for male humans or the standard set you learned for female humans. They have elements of both. These are actually pretty common. We're not 100% sure how common because some of them are hard to detect and only show up if someone happens to have both it and another issue that results in tests that uncover it. But it's estimated to be at least 6% of the population, which, as we will see, is actually significantly more than the number of trans people. The other specifier is post-transition, which I did misspell, sorry about that. That can only be applied to gender dysphoria in adults and adolescents, and it refers to someone who has already done everything that is available for them to do, that they want to do, to live as their gender in the world, and is still in need of treatment ongoing. So the DSM gives some prevalence numbers. Again, this was written in 2013. There's been research since then. The DSM even acknowledges that the number it's giving are probably underestimates. It gives ranges of about 0.005% to about 1.5 hundredths of a percent for people who are assigned male at birth. It doesn't use that language. It calls them boys because it was written by, frankly, transphobes, which is another problem with it. And for people who are assigned female at birth, which it does not call people assigned female at birth, it calls them girls, because the whole thing is written from a perspective that assumes that people's correct gender is whether or not they have a penis. 2 to 3 thousandths of a percent. It's actually about 100 times that common, according to more recent research. Trans people represent about 0.5% to about 1.25% of the population, according to most estimates. Which makes us, if I remember my numbers correctly, roughly as common as natural redheads. The DSM covers what's called differential diagnosis, which is, in addition to giving the symptoms of the disorder, it also lists some things that might be confused with the disorder and explains how to tell the difference. The first thing it lists is gender nonconformity. Again, it is simply untrue that psychologists are looking at gender nonconforming children or teenagers or adults and saying, you're gender nonconforming, you must be trans. It specifically says not to do that. Someone needs to have expressed for themselves that their identity is a different gender than the one they were assigned at birth, that their desire is to be a different gender than the one that they were assigned at birth, at least one of the two. Men can wear dresses all they want without becoming women. Women who wear dresses, or not, as they prefer, may or may not have penises. That's all there is to it. The way you tell is you ask the person what their gender is. Transvestic disorder is another one that it lists, which there's controversy around transvestic disorder and indeed about most of the paraphilic disorders that don't involve a violation of consent. Why they're even in there. Because why is any behavior that is consensual considered a disorder? Any sexual behavior? But they're still in there. And in that case, that's somebody who derives sexual pleasure from cross-dressing. And that is totally unrelated to being trans, because when somebody is cross-dressing, that's their gender expression being out of sync with their core and conscious gender. Somebody who is trans, their gender expression may be out of sync with their assigned gender at birth, but the whole reason they're doing it is to try to bring their expression into accordance with their core and or conscious gender. They're not deriving, it's also not a sex thing. We'll get into that in discussing the history, but there's a long history of researchers believing that being trans is about sex because they couldn't comprehend of any other reason for it, but it never has been. Body dysmorphia is another one that it could be confused with. In body dysmorphia, a person perceives a part of their own body as being malformed in some way and become obsessed with eliminating it or removing it from themselves. This is a focus on that body part and its function as that body part, where somebody who has gender dysphoria may have parts of their body that they wish to be rid of, but that's because those parts of their body are out of sync with their gender, not because they're innately broken or malfunctioning or malformed in themselves. It's an important distinction. The removal of the body part is not an end in itself. It's part of the goal the person has of becoming, of bringing their body more in accordance with their gender. Finally, it's not a schizophrenic or psychotic disorder. Very rarely, there are, in fact, people who have those disorders and have a delusion of gender. a delusion that they have a gender other than what it is. However, those people do not experience the other symptoms of gender dysphoria in either the DSM description of it or the kind of how trans people who have gender dysphoria actually experience gender dysphoria senses of it. And the gender of trans people does not behave like a delusion. It has a different date of typical onset. It's much more stable and lifelong. It's much, even in gender fluid people, the fluidity is stable and lifelong. It does not respond to the drugs and therapies used to treat delusions. It is quite simply not anything like a delusion. In addition, the other symptoms of psychotic disorders that tend to accompany delusions are usually not present in trans people. And the only reason I say usually is sometimes trans people are schizophrenic or have another psychotic disorder, but the delusion is not their gender. They'll have, if they have delusions, it'll be about something else. Now, one area that is important to discuss with trans people is comorbidity. Now, again, the DSM entry is kind of confused about trans people versus gender dysphoria, and it's been a guide to a lot of research. So the research mostly talks about the prevalence of disorders among trans people, as opposed to people with gender dysphoria. In fact, because of that, we don't know how common gender dysphoria is. It is believed that the majority of trans people have gender dysphoria, but not all do, and what percentage is not actually known. That said, gender dysphoria as described in the DSM is essentially identical to the definition of being trans, so it's universal among trans people. I know that's a little confusing. Again, it's a badly written DSM entry. Anyway, in terms of comorbidities, the DSM lists 3 that were well-known and research supported in 2013. 2 more have become identified since. The most common disorder among trans people is the anxiety disorders, anything in that family of disorders. Roughly 73% of trans people have an anxiety disorder. For depressive disorders, the research actually kind of disagrees on what percentage, but it's always high. The research is consistent in showing a very high percentage of trans people have a depressive disorder. How high is a little more questionable, but I've seen figures ranging from 45% to 72%. Kind of a mysterious one, autism spectrum disorder. Trans people are about 3 to 6 times more likely to be autistic than the general population, and no one knows why. Theories have been floated along the lines of certain patterns of behavior found in autistic people might cause someone to interpret gender nonconformity as being trans. The problem is that if that were the case, taking hormones would worsen gender dysphoria, whereas it typically makes it better in autistic people. So that's not what's going on. It's a little mysterious what's going on, but in part 2, I'll be discussing some recent research which actually does give some insight into what the connection might be. The 2 identified since the DSM was published, the DSM-5, are dissociative disorders. These are also quite common among trans people, possibly. 30% of trans people have symptoms of dissociation. But the research has actually been inconclusive on whether it's because trans people have an increased likelihood of developing a dissociative disorder that is separate from gender dysphoria, or if dissociation is a symptom of gender dysphoria. There's some reason to think that it might actually be a form of dissociative disorder in a sense, with a very different cause for most dissociative disorders. Most are caused by traumatic experiences. Gender dysphoria, on the other hand, appears to be congenital, which is to say you're born with it. Kind of. I'll get into it in part 2. The dissociative disorders, we saw a lot of those symptoms in the previous slide with my description of what it, those descriptions I was reading of what it feels like to have gender dysphoria. A lot of that was describing dissociation. There was depersonalization, which is the feeling that one is not real, like feeling like you yourself are unreal. There was a derealization, which is the feeling like the world around you is not real in some way, like it's less real. Um, and there was some kind of emotional dissociation, dulling of feelings, disconnection from one's own feelings. These are all typical of dissociative disorders. Finally, trauma disorders are very common amongst trans people. I was unable to find numbers on what percentage of trans people have a history of trauma, but I was able to find 45% have childhood trauma, which means adding in adult traumas would only increase that number. So at least 45% of trans people have some form of trauma disorder. Now, that's one reason to think that there might be dissociative disorders going on, because the typical cause of a dissociative disorder is childhood trauma at a very young age. However, there also appears to be dissociative disorder or dissociative symptoms occurring in trans people who do not have a history of childhood trauma at a sufficiently young age. Now, one aspect that may be in play here is there's a phenomenon known as minority stress. This is a known thing where members of marginalized populations tend to have higher rates of disorders that are associated with high levels of stress. Anxiety disorders, depressive disorders, dissociative disorders, and trauma disorders, all four of them are more likely in people who experience very high levels of stress at particular points in their life. For anxiety, depressive, and trauma, it's at onset. For dissociative disorders, it's in early childhood. And being marginalized is very stressful, so it's understandable that those, it's kind of a major societal problem, but it makes sense that people from marginalized communities would have higher occurrences of these disorders. However, these numbers are really, really high. So something else is going on. In addition, rates of occurrence of autism are unaffected by minority stress because minority stress is an environmental factor and autism is congenital. So it's unclear what the other factor is, although the theory I'll be talking about in part 2 does provide some insight into that as well, the findings in neuropsych. The last thing I want to talk about on this slide is protective factors. Protective factors, when you're talking about a disorder, are things that either reduce your likelihood of developing the disorder or reduce the severity of the disorder or of comorbid disorders. And for gender dysphoria, the primary protective factor is social acceptance as one's core gender. Let me repeat that. The primary protective factor, the thing that makes suffering less in trans people, is being recognized as the gender we say we are. In particular, being acknowledged as our true gender and accepted as our true gender by our families of origin at a young age. And I'm saying true gender, I'm talking core gender as opposed to assigned gender at birth. It reduces the distress from dysphoria. It reduces the frequency at which most of the comorbid disorders occur. I've not seen anything about its impact on autism spectrum disorder, but I suspect it doesn't have one because, again, that's congenital. And most importantly, it dramatically reduces suicidality. Roughly 40% of trans people attempt suicide at some point in their lives. But among trans people who are accepted as their core gender from an early age by their family of origin and by the community around them, that number drops into the single digits. I would even go so far, based on that, to say that insisting on your child's assigned gender at birth in opposition to their internal sense of their own gender is a form of child abuse. Because anything that has that high of a chance of resulting in your child's death is not an okay thing to do to your child. Period. And that's before we even get into how much suffering it can cause your child. For absolutely no benefit whatsoever, except that you don't have to admit that you and the doctor were wrong when they were babies. All right. How did this diagnosis get so messed up? Basically, it's Harry Benjamin's fault. But let's get into it a little bit. So, the first person to really do a scientific study of what were then called transsexual people was Magnus Hirschfeld, a German who started publishing work on the topic in 1910. However, most of his research, along with the research of his German colleagues, was destroyed by the Nazis in the 1930s. If you've ever seen the really famous picture of the Nazi book burning, that was actually his work and his institute's work that they were burning in that photo. That is what that is a photo of, is the destruction of research about not only trans people, but lesbians, gay people, basically the entirety of what we would now call the LGBT community. Hirschfeld's Institute started research on that, and all of that early work was destroyed by the Nazis. So, you know, those of you who oppose trans people have some great company you're in. Anyway, Harry Benjamin was a colleague of Hirschfeld, but because he was an American, he escaped the Nazi purges. In fact, he wasn't even there for them. He was in the US. He was also a colleague of Kinsey, of the infamous Kinsey Report on Human Sexuality, which attempted to create, among other things, attempted to create a scale that ranked how gay people were, from 0, meaning straight, through the middle numbers, which would be bisexual, and to a 6, which meant somebody who was completely gay. And Benjamin, kind of imitating that, tried to create a scale of how trans you were. This is a bad idea, for the record. It's really not a concept that makes sense with being trans, because either you are your gender assigned at birth or you're not. But he also thought that being trans and cross-dressing were associated, because he fundamentally thought of trans people as somebody who was their assigned gender at birth and had a disorder. He thought of trans women, which is really all he studied. He ignored trans men and non-binary people entirely. He thought of trans women as men with a disorder. And he thought that disorder was associated in some way with homosexuality, which is also incorrect. Being trans is not a sex thing. Trans people may derive pleasure from being our actual genders because, dear God, is it a relief? We may even associate that pleasure with sex in some way at times, simply because it feels good, and practically anything that feels good can be connected with sex in some way. Practically anything that feels bad can be connected with sex in some way, because a lot of human beings spend a lot of time thinking about sex, but there's no fundamental connection. His scale and his association of being trans with homosexuality became the standards for gatekeeping of treatment. On the one hand, he helped people get treatment who would not be able to otherwise. Early forms of surgery and hormonal treatments were introduced through concepts he kind of introduced into the scientific community. But they were accompanied by his incorrect ideas about people being different levels of trans and having to be gay to be trans and having to quote-unquote dress as a woman to be trans, and the resulting gatekeeping created a lot of problems in not only the treatment of trans people in decades to come, but in the classification of trans people and the diagnosis in decades to come. So the first kind of precursor to the current gender dysphoria diagnosis in the DSM was introduced in the DSM-3 in 1980. It classified gender identity disorders as a subset of psychosexual disorders, again following Benjamin's incorrect belief that being trans was a sex thing. And it had 3 subtypes: transsexualism, gender identity disorder of childhood, and atypical gender identity disorder. The list of criteria was actually not that different from what is in there now. It was just shorter. And it talked about an incongruence between physical sex and expressed gender. Now, physical sex in this context pretty much means, is there a penis or not, which means it's identical to assigned gender at birth. And so that really isn't a change in anything except wording. Gender identity disorder of childhood had different criteria for people assigned male at birth to people assigned female at birth, which again it referred to as boys and girls because researchers following Benjamin put primacy on the body instead of the person's experience. Basically, it made either a desire to change physical characteristics or gender nonconforming behavior a sufficient criterion for boys, meaning people assigned male at birth, or for people assigned female at birth, only the desire for a change of physical characteristics was listed. Reason being was the assumption that a girl wanting to be a boy was a perfectly normal thing, while a boy wanting to be a girl, again in the minds of the researchers who are classifying as boys or girls incorrectly, but in the mind of a boy, wanting to be a girl is wrong, an indication of a psychiatric diagnosis, because sexism. In the DSM-3R, published in 1987, this was a revision of the DSM, the gender identity disorders were moved to a category called disorders of childhood, under the mistaken belief that people always know they're trans as children. This is untrue. Many people do not realize that they are trans until adolescence or adulthood. People can realize they're trans at any point in their lives because there's a lot of social pressure to not be trans. So people don't believe that they are, they just feel bad until eventually they figure it out. It also added gender identity disorder of adolescents and adults, non-transsexual type, for people to finally acknowledge that not everyone who is trans wants surgery or hormonal treatment. Many trans people elect to do one or the other or neither. They, are happy with social transition and just want to be accepted as their gender without having to do a bunch of medical procedures. So this was finally acknowledging that that exists, and it's not some kind of inferior form of being trans or somehow being less trans. The DSM-4 and 4TR, published in 94 and 2000, then moved it again to a category called sexual and gender identity disorders. So it was again with the sex disorders, but they were at least sort of semi-acknowledging that it's not the same thing as a sex disorder, so starting to get it into their heads that being trans is not a sex thing. It was also collapsed into a single diagnosis called gender identity disorder, and the different criteria for assigned male at birth and assigned female at birth children were made less different, but there was still some difference. Finally, in the DSM-5, gender dysphoria was moved into its own category, and the name was changed to try to emphasize that it's the dysphoria that's the problem, not the gender, but since the criteria were left the way that they are, it still pretty much expresses that gender is the problem, not dysphoria, which is incorrect. Alright, so that is the end of part 1, and we will continue in part 2 with the treatment and some promising research in neuropsychology that may give insight into the causes of gender dysphoria and even how gender forms generally throughout the population, and then talk about kind of the core struggle over whether this diagnosis even belongs in the DSM, and finally some thoughts on different things that might be done to fix the issues with it. And that'll be it. I'll see you all there. Bye.